I'll put it up on iLearn just in case you need to review the class. I won't record all the classes, but just the first couple weeks. Okay, let's see, what should we talk about first? So I wanted to talk about A Couple in the Cage, and then the othering article, and then we'll do a little bit of like brainstorming, and we'll look at some clips on Orientalism and kind of discuss that a bit, okay? So in terms of the Couple in the Cage video, it's a really like interesting experience. So I wanted you to kind of watch the first half of the video and then kind of record your responses to that, how you're feeling about it, and then watch the second half. So in terms of the first half of the video, what were some of your reactions to it?
I had a few different reactions because it was just like there were so many different going on. Like I felt it was just like some people were saying this, some people felt bad, but some people were laughing about it, and it was just like, I think to me it was that adults were laughing and the kids seemed more like, and then I think it was in the first part, I believe, where the adult was like, oh, I want questions, but I just have to remind myself that I'm an adult.
Yeah, that's true. And that's an interesting like division between adults and kids. And so do you feel like you were more surprised by the adult reactions then?
Yeah.
That they were more like taken in by the experience. Oh yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, what were some other reactions to it, to the first half?
For me, at the beginning, I thought it was like a theater performance. But then I got surprised when I heard ranchera music in Spanish with the famous song called México Lindo y Querido. And most of all, when they were saying that they were from this little island in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, I was like, wait a minute, I got confused. And I thought to myself, you know, they're either lying or maybe it disappeared, because the story I know, it never existed. So that's when I started, my reaction kind of changed. And then the visitors, like my classmate said, you know, the children were all excited to see them. And it was just weird by seeing, you know, the TV and the computer and all this items from, you know, the new era, but they were dressed, you know, different from back then. So then you notice, you know, they're either, I thought they were criticizing, but then at the end it was totally different.
Yeah, and so that was really interesting. That so for somebody who's familiar with like the geography of Mexico or Central America, would be like, I haven't heard of this before. I'm not sure, right? So what is this? But then people who were from other like Western countries who don't, I think, take the responsibility to know geography that well and kind of just assume there are places in the world that I don't know about that are so exotic and that haven't been discovered yet, right? And so they would be much more likely to be like, oh, okay, sure, you know, like accepting of that. So I think that was interesting too, and interesting like differences between where they were traveling to and what people's reactions were, right? I felt in, especially in the US, people were really willing to go along with this. And in other countries, people kind of questioned it a bit more. Not entirely, but that was something that I kind of like noticed. Let me share my screen. So any other reactions to it, like initially?
For me, I think I initially was like, okay, wait, what is the point? Like, what are we trying to get at this? Because otherwise it just seemed like they were further perpetuating the idea that natives are like savages or animals to be caged and, you know, spectated on.
Mhm.
And then I had the thought of like, okay, maybe they're like exposing, you know, these ideas that may still be present today, as we've seen with some of the like spectators or some of the people in the audience. And then I also had the idea of like, maybe they're like exploiting the audience's ignorance, you know, for money or like whatever the case may be. And I was like, okay, get your coin, like, you know, because they will be, I don't know, like some of them were like really feeding into it or being stuck in the idea that because they've never heard of this place or whatever the case may be, and exotic is a term that's been coined for like other cultures that are outside of the European um, dynamic, I guess, that it could be a possibly like real thing or a real place. So they seeing it for their eyes and engaged makes it like an authentic experience for them. So I don't know, that's what I was thinking. Had a few different.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting question, is like, is this kind of performance art, right? Perpetuating these images. And when we talk about the second half, that would be kind of an interesting thing to talk about. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
I think for me, from the get-go, as soon as they started bringing them out on a leash, I knew this was fake, and I just kept getting really irritated and like cringed at all the people who acted, not even acted, they thought that this was real and that this was even a possibility of how we would show another culture, is by, even though they say it's like they wanted to go on this world tour to show people that they existed, why would we ever put people in cages? Why would we ever put people on a leash into a museum? That's kind of like the opposite of what museums are trying to do.
Well, yeah, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. Go ahead, finish.
Well, I was just gonna say I just found it really fascinating. But then they do things like I kept cringing and being really annoyed that people were paying for services, and like when the male exposed himself was like a thing you could pay for, and the people like clapped. I was like, what is going on? How are people not noticing that this is like an art piece? This is a thought-provoking piece that they're trying to say something, and people are just like, wow, look how they're really good at drinking Coca-Cola, an American tradition they've picked up so well.
Yeah, and so I think so there's like a few things there that are really interesting to talk about. So like with the exposure, right? And people paying him to expose himself. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but when he exposed himself, he had tucked in his genitalia,
Yeah.
right? So it looked very feminine. And that's really a commentary on othering, right? So in terms of othering, males of non-Western cultures, right, of the New World, of other cultures, are depicted as either extremely dangerous, and that term savage is used very much, or also desexualized, right? So their sexuality is taken away, and they're portrayed as being non-masculine, right? Incredibly like feminine. And so that was a really interesting commentary on that. So yeah, so actually a unit that we're going to do later in the semester is going to look at human zoos. This was very much a big part of like an extension of colonialism, and people were brought back, right, from other countries and exhibited in America in cages, and exhibited in Europe, right, and taken on tour. And so this really did happen. And it was a big form of entertainment for people, right? And it kind of relates to a sideshow tradition, right? People who had visible disabilities. So perhaps like people with microcephaly who had small heads, right? People who were born with various disabilities were put on exhibit. So this really is a tradition that has gone back for quite a long time. And so when we get into that unit, we'll look at that more in depth. But museums have perpetuated some really terrible things. And so if any of you have heard of the Hottentot Venus, are any of you familiar with her? Sarah Bartman. Okay, so we'll be looking at her. And this like exhibition of people really like exoticizes and sexualizes them. And so she was put on exhibit, and her genitalia was a big part of that exhibit, right? And even after she died, the castings were made of her body. Parts of her body were like preserved in these museums. I think she was like housed in a museum in Paris up until like the very recently, maybe the 90s. And they had made casts of all of her private parts, taken all these measurements of her body, and like all these parts of her body were put on display, right, up until very recently. So yeah, museums play a big part in perpetuating this colonial like image. So we'll be looking at that, but that's what kind of the second part of the film examined. It started to kind of give some images of people who had been put on display and displayed at like world's fairs. There was Ota Benga is another example we'll look at, and he was put on display at the Bronx Zoo, right? So this is, I mean, if you think of like history-wise, fairly recent like examples of it. And you can see like with the audience's reaction that people get really like excited about seeing other human beings. And that is kind of reinforcing these notions of othering and kind of recomforting the self by saying, wow, look at this person on display. They're so strange and different, and I'm so normal. I get to stand back and look at them, right? Yeah, so when, so Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Pena are performance artists from San Francisco, and they decided to create this performance arts piece to critique human zoos, right, this history, and to expose this history of human zoos, and to kind of expose these ideas of othering and force people to kind of face that. And so it's interesting, they said at the beginning of this, when they were going to go on tour, they were really nervous, you know, because with performance art, it makes you really uncomfortable. The goal of performance art is to make you squirm and to make you feel like, oh, I don't feel all right with this, right? And they thought that people were going to protest them and have this really negative reaction to their performance, right? They were prepared for that. But what they were not prepared for was that people didn't realize it was a performance and thought that this really was people being put on exhibit and were really taken into this. So that was a very surprising thing. And so they said kind of being confronted with these like people who seem so different and like other, people's guards really went down, right? And you like saw the party at one of the natural history museums, and people were drinking and kind of taking pictures and hanging out, like, oh, right. So were there any like other reactions to then the second half of the film kind of being revealed as part of that like history of human exhibition?
I know for me, I was really glad that they added in the historical images. Because like you do remember from school, or you do know the like one or two images you did see where it was like, oh, they showed cannibals, or like, but you think of it as so far, like so long ago that it kind of doesn't register. But this was like what, 1992, 93, which isn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And people still believed it. And there was only a few people in the video who seemed to either know it was like an art piece. Like there was a guy from Madrid who was just like, oh, I thought it was about America, and a comment on it. and then other people who were just sad to see people in cages. But then everyone else was like putting their children up in the front row of like it's story time and things like that. So I like that there was historical references to then like read, like vigorate my memory of the experiences. And I wrote a little bit about The Greatest Showman. We like grant this movie like, oh, it's so good, they did it so well, but it's not historically accurate, and a lot of like it's very much glorifying like these people were put on display by him because of how they were, and just because it's flashy and has all this other stuff doesn't take away from how wrong that is.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's kind of an interesting thing, like with like sideshows and circuses, um, that it's profiting off of people's difference, right? And so people who have some sort of physical difference or disability become like freaks in a freak show, right? There were people though within that community who kind of also said, hey, you know, at that time before IDEA, before ADA, before a lot of things. So IDEA guarantees that people with disabilities have access to public education, free and appropriate public education. And then ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which mandated access, right, to public spaces. So people who with really profound disabilities were not often in public spaces because it was just not accessible to them or not open or accepting, right? And people still today are not accepting of disability, but at least there's some laws that give some guarantees. So people like with various developmental disabilities generally were not employed, right? And so this was a way, they say that this is a way for people to be employed, right? To have a career, to travel and do things that they would not have done before. And that would be like an interesting thing to discuss. Overall, I think it's much better not to have people on display, but that this sideshow tradition would be something really interesting to look into. I see as a way of continuing othering, right? How about any other people? Did anybody else like, you know, think about the performance art piece of it or its commentary?
I think another one of my favorite parts on part 2 was where people started canceling their membership to the museum, and I was like, oh well, at least something is being done out of that. But then I was like, maybe, but sometimes like just canceling your membership is not enough for like that.
Yeah. So some people were like outraged, right, and just said, I no, right. And so like when people were put on exhibit, it's not like it was always widely accepted. So like with Oda Banga, there was a great like outcry in the community, and people lobbied on his behalf and went to courts on his behalf and were able to get him released. But then he was put into kind of this religious educational setting, and so he was never really fully free. But there were people who were fighting against that. Any other thoughts on that? I think there was something I was going to say, but my brain it's so early. Oh yeah, so with the natural history museums. So I'm sure, how many of you have visited natural history museums? Probably many people, not everybody. Yeah. Okay. So if you go to a natural history museum, it's really interesting because it's like what the dominant culture, whoever's putting on like the museum, sees to be like needing preservation, and what they want to put on display as kind of exotic, right? So there's many animals that are the mini museums were like taxidermied animals, right? A lot of animals from like the Asian continent or African continent that were kind of like brought back as specimens. And then for a lot of the museums, right, you can think about the exhibits that they had of like what were termed to be primitive or, you know, ancient people. And you walk into a room and then it'll have a diorama of like, you know, people with their hunting gear or whatever. And they talk about this is what life was like in the past. And so that is also kind of part of this performance art piece that people picture the other as being old or ancient or in the past and not existing in the present, right? So when they had television and were listening to music on boom boxes at the time, you know, it was relevant technology, and people were kind of like, oh wow, they watch TV, oh they listen to music, wow, right? Because there's this expectation that people that are other exist in the past and that they never change and that they're always primitive, right? These ideas of primitive and other and exotic are very tied together, right? So I just love this piece. I love performance art and I love making people uncomfortable, right? As a way to force people to think about history. So I think this is a really like interesting tactic that they used as a way to expose this and expose really a lot about people's attitudes about othering, right? That people are very willing to go along with it. So yeah, I like throughout the class, we'll kind of look at different ways of speaking back to this history, this really problematic and troubled history. And I think performance art is definitely a way to do that. Okay, so what do I want to do next? Let's talk about then the othering article. So the otherness article. And I had made kind of a little video, a very short clip, going over what some of the main points were in this. But kind of primarily like in terms of othering, this being like the main theory that we're examining throughout the semester. Othering is kind of determining the self and the other, the in-group and the out-group. And so it's saying the in-group is the dominant group. They get to decide what is normal and what is seen as okay. And so they create an out-group. And the out-group is kind of a fictionalized construct, right? It's something that people create in society, but even though it's not physically real, right? So like if you, I'm sure a lot of you have taken classes on race. Race is something that you cannot, the more you try to like define different races, the more difficult that becomes because it's really not possible to do so. They have tried to like legitimize it through pseudoscience, through measurements of the body, measurements of features, that kind of thing. But it's really like not real. But since it's something that society really builds itself around, it has real consequences, right? So that's like othering. Othering, the outgroup is not real, but there are real consequences to this, right? And so this like real consequences can happen through like segregation. It can happen through one country coming in and colonizing another. It can happen through laws that may privilege one group of people over another or deny rights to groups that deserve it, right? And so denying like very basic rights to certain groups or preventing those groups from accessing those rights, that those are extensions of othering. And when we kind of looked at exoticism in like our first class, exoticism is a way of kind of maintaining those boundaries of othering and saying, accentuating difference and kind of comforting the self as being like superior, right? And so it's saying, I'm normal, I'm boring, I am typical, and the exotic is exciting and different and extreme and wild and like all these like fantasies, right? So really like creating in-groups and out-groups is a way of kind of maintaining this identity of the in-group. That's what it's really about, right? So it's saying, I only know who I am because I know that you are not me, right? So it's this in-group only knows who they are by saying everybody else is different, right? And on the outside. Now this like obviously like has so many real world consequences, but also can create these like extremes. If you see people who become part of extremist movements, which very much like unfortunately is happening in America today, right? You have groups that then will justify violence against other people by saying, well, they're not me, I can't trust them, they're dangerous, right? So like I was just have been so upset about that the 17-year-old boy who took that AR-15 and shot and killed protesters in Wisconsin, right? That kind of extremism is part of othering, right? And it's saying, you are so different from me that I need to take you down, right? What are some other things? I mentioned some of this stuff. Okay. Oh, and then in a few weeks, we're going to watch a really interesting film called Cannibal Tours. And so in this, exoticism is really kind of a theme, right? And so these are tours that people took to New Guinea and would go on these tours to kind of see cannibals, right? And they really get caught up in this idea of people being really exotic or strange. So it'll be interesting to see your reactions to that. And it was a documentary, you know, these existed and still exist, right? Kind of going out to like see the exotic other. Okay, so let me find my notes here. So I'm going to just do a really quick exercise with us. I'm just going to share. There's the chat. Okay, so in the chat, I'm sharing a link again to our brainstorming document. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so I'm going to just put you into small groups for like 3 or 4 minutes. And I'd like you in your group to think of some examples of self and other, right? And I know this can be kind of like uncomfortable. I trust that you guys can do this, okay? Because I want us to look at like the power and privilege of self and how that affects how the other is treated, right? So what could be an example of, and so this could be either within a culture or one culture to another, right? So say when we are reading Columbus next week, Columbus sees the self as himself, right? The West. He's traveling for Spain, representing Spain, so that becomes the self. The other becomes the people that he interacts with, right? So when he goes to these various islands in the Caribbean, the people he encounters, he sees as this exotic other. This can also like happen within every culture, right? Has the self and the other, has the in-group and the out-group. So what could be like another example? Well, we'll see what you guys come up with and then we'll discuss these, all right? So just take a couple minutes. Oh, I need to put you in groups first. Um, it's so much easier when we're physically there. Okay. Hi, did you get your invite for your breakout room?
Katana. Sorry, I left early. That was a total accident. I didn't hear your last thought.
And I realized I'm mic'd. I was muted. I just added another thing to our example. You're good.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Okay, so let's take a look at what you all wrote. Okay, let's look at, and you'll probably think of more ideas as we kind of go through these and explain them. So let's look at group 2. So for group 2, there's several examples that you came up with. People within the heterosexual community are seen as the self, right? So the in-group. And then people within the LGBTQ plus community are seen as the out-group. Yes, definitely, right? And so this becomes apparent in a lot of laws that are created, right? And taking away rights of various people. A lot of fears. A couple of years ago, there were there was a lot of public debate about bathrooms and whether people of the trans community should be allowed to use the bathroom of their gender, or if it should be defined by the gender of their birth, and that kind of thing. And it put a lot of people in the LGBTQ community at risk, right? Because forcing people to use a bathroom of their gender at birth it can create a lot of problems, right? And can put people in very vulnerable positions. Bathrooms are very vulnerable places, right? People get attacked in bathrooms for not fitting into the norm, right? And you all included the gay trans panic defense. Yes, so if you want to add to that, I'm add to what I have to say, but I'm thinking about people who murder trans people, right? And saying, I didn't know that they were trans and I was in a sexual situation with them and I just had to defend myself, or I had to defend my honor, right? As a straight person. And a lot of people are murdered because of that. Not because of that, that's used as like a justification for it, a false justification. But did this group want to add some more to this?
I had, sorry if you can hear my dog snoring. He snores like a grown man. But I had thought of this because I was watching like a docuseries about people being released from jail, and it initially started as a murder, and he was released because he said that the cashier he attacked was gay, and tried to blackmail him into a homosexual relationship. And the fact that like they give like leeway to people, it's almost like what do you call it? How do you like claim insanity or something like that? To get like or whatever case may be, excuses
like a defense.
Yeah, exactly. Excuses you from the crimes and that you've actually committed against a person. And I remember taking a feminist class and hearing so many stories about transgender people from that community, and like just self-defense, really maybe accidentally killing their attacker and then being sent to jail because of it. And it's like, it makes you think of who inside of this self and then inside of this other, there's also like this conversation of like who can be a victim.
Yeah, and who's like a good victim?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, an innocent victim. Yeah, and so people who defend themselves, right, against attacks are given much greater consequences than someone who supposedly is defending themselves against sexual advances. And a lot of times I think it's people who were trying to like explore their like other like potentially may have been like homosexual, but were so afraid of themselves, right, that they attacked somebody else and said, I can't like, let my defenses down. I can't let anybody know that I like you know, may have different feelings than what I put out, right? That I'm not, you know, potentially fitting in this heterosexual box. And so I have to attack somebody else to prove that, right? I have to harm somebody else to prove that. I have to kill somebody else to prove that. And then they don't really get prosecuted in the same way, if at all, right? Because they're like, well, it's, you know, you're defending yourself. And so people in the trans community are much more vulnerable to violence, and trans women are killed at really high rates, right? And people, like friends that I have who are trans women, another part of this too is that they're very exoticized, right? And males who would deem themselves as heterosexual have a lot of curiosity about them. And a lot of trans women, because of discrimination in the workplace, have difficulty getting jobs. Not everybody, but the people I know have had difficulty with that. And so end up kind of turning to sex work as a way to pay the bills, right? Because you have to survive. And a lot of, like, you know, heterosexual men really exoticize them and are kind of fascinated and want to have these experiences with them and then ditch them or attack them, right? So it's puts them in this really extra vulnerable position. And that's because of this exoticizing and this othering, right? Not because of who they are. This is because the way that society like treats them, right? So it puts them at this greater risk. So being othered puts them at like physical risk. And so if they were kind of given more protections, right, and treated more as the self, it would be much, yeah. So anyway, we could get into a lot of discrimination that happens because of this othering, right? It's used as justification, false justification, but I'm not sure if I'm explaining that enough, but anyway, yeah. What are some other things? Okay, American European descent, minority and ethnic communities. Yes, so many communities that are deemed to be minority communities are pushed to the outside, are othered, right? And are not given the same legal protections, are not given the same access to housing, right? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Right, so within the Chinese Exclusion Act, it limited the number of people who could immigrate to the United States from China. And then what also happened in many communities, and if any of you like live locally in the Salinas area, right, and this happened in, like, I believe in Watsonville, in Monterey, right, there were Chinatowns. These sprung up because people of Chinese descent were not allowed to purchase property outside of these like determined areas. So they couldn't buy homes, right? Nobody would sell it to them. They were forced to live in these very small, cramped communities, which in some ways like was help preserve cultural traditions because these became kind of self-contained communities. But it really pushed them to the outside and said you cannot enter into the more mainstream areas of the community. You have to stay in your place. And a lot of this othering is about stay in your place, right? And Chinatowns, like in the Chinatown Salinas and in the one in Monterey Pacific Grove area, there were a lot of fires, right? Because people from the dominant culture, right, would go and set them on fire. Right? They were so incensed by the presence of the other that they wanted to incinerate them, right? And so there were many fires in these communities because people from the outside would come in and do that, right? So there's, again, physical risk created by this othering. Familiarity with one's own culture, and then what's seen as uncommon or exotic. Physical attributes. Okay, yeah, so the in-group, the dominant culture, definitely tries to define itself by what is seen as beautiful, right, or the norm. So having really long blonde hair, having blue eyes, being thin, right? Especially in terms of feminine beauty. So people spend a lot of money to try and create that kind of image, right? Paying for extensions, paying to bleach their hair, putting in false contacts, right? The beauty industry and spending so much money to be thin. And then the other then is seen as, in terms of femininity, in Western culture, the other would be women who have more like curvy bodies, right? Women, so when we look at like Hottentot Venus, she was put on display because people said she had a very like large bottom, right? And so it's like, wow, she's not thin, she's not super skinny, this is different and exotic, and it becomes very sexualized. Oh, okay, I really dislike Miley Cyrus, okay, for many reasons, but can anybody guess why I might really dislike her in this context? Okay, so a couple years ago, she decided to appropriate ratchet culture, right? And to use it to further her own career. And so as a white woman, she tried to take on this like othering culture, and she used the bodies of women of color as accessories, right? And she, on, oh, what was it? I don't know. I feel so old saying this, but like maybe it was a Video Music Awards, I'm not sure, where she came out and was wearing this like spandex outfit and was trying to like twerk, but she really can't. And so she she then used the bodies of women of color to do that for her, right? And she would show like pictures of them in her videos, have them around her as accessories in her videos, right? And so in doing that, it's saying, wow, look at all this like exotic difference. Like these bodies are so different from me, like the skinny little Miley Cyrus. And I'm using them as kind of not people, right? They were there for images. So that is this othering, right? So if anybody wants to write on Miley Cyrus, I would give you extra credit because she's very problematic and never really owned up to that, right? And using like the bodies of women of color. Okay, so let's look at breakout room 1. I'm just moving up. So we have what is deemed normal and then what is deemed weird or kind of not fitting in with that group. So can anybody from this group kind of give me maybe perhaps an example of what's seen as like normal?
I think a lot of us just talked about the feeling more than a specific, because everyone grew up in such different towns that like normal doesn't necessarily have a specific look. Like in Arizona, it might have looked different than California or Oregon. But seeing that there was a normal crowd and that there was an other crowd, or like a weird, being like the weird kid, and some of us described you knew who was in what group, or we described ourselves as the weird kid. And like weird didn't have to be bad, it was just we felt different than the majority.
So I'll add, so if I may, I want to add to that. So I'm thinking of cliques, right? Is that what you all were thinking of? Right. So
I mean, some of us, yeah.
Yeah. So that makes sense. Like, so being in the popular group, right, is seen as normal. And so it's people are pressured to try and attain whatever standards that like normal popular group determines to be those standards, and everybody else is seen as weird. So like theater kids, if I know that Mean Girls has reached kind of cult status, right? So a lot of you are familiar with Mean Girls. So yeah, what are they called? The Plastics?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have the Plastics who are the in group, right? The dominant group. they're seen as normal, and they get to create and write all the rules for everybody else. And then if there was a scene, I think when Lindsay Lohan is kind of surveying the lunchroom,
Yeah.
where all of the tables were. Yeah. So in that saying, the center, right, is the plastics and all of these other groups. And I, like watching it is really cringy because a lot of the groups were determined by race.
Yeah.
Right. And or if whatever they were into, but even like the students of Asian descent were broken up into these like really
Smart versus
restrictive.
hot.
Hmm?
It was like smart versus hot.
Yeah. So those are stereotypes, right? So othering is built on stereotypes. So these stereotypes of either somebody who's an Asian student has to be really smart and has to achieve a lot, right? Or Asian women especially are very exoticized and sexualized, right? And so nobody in this main plastics group was not white, right? Very white. So yeah, so that's kind of it could be a lot, like if we even looked at like films about high school culture, or if any of you are into Heathers, that is kind of a really interesting precursor to Mean Girls. Okay, and then Disney, Nickelodeon, talented kids shows, smarter than a fifth grader. Oh,
A
so
lot of us we're
mhm.
looking at it as like our own perspective, as opposed to like group 2 was like their own perspective, but culturally. So we were trying to think of things that when we were younger, we would have considered self or other.
It's interesting though, like if any of you want to go back and watch any of the shows that you watched as kids, you probably will start to notice things that you're like, oh, ooh, I didn't even notice this when I was little. And like a lot of jokes that are in television shows are about maintaining the self and pushing out the other, right? So a lot of, I don't know if any of you watch like Saturday Night Live or any other shows, there are a lot of shows made about jokes made about sexuality, right? And so that's by saying, oh, see, I can joke about it because I'm the self, and you're, whoever I'm joking about is the other, and they're strange, and I don't want to, a lot of like homophobic jokes, or jokes about race, caricatures of race, right? Those are all things that you probably will start to notice if you start to look back on shows that you watched as a kid. Okay, and then breakout room 3. Could somebody from this group tell us about your examples?
We said the movies because sometimes, I mean, I know it's not just me, it's everyone. We watch a movie like on a certain culture, and the movie just like doesn't really speak out about what really happened, but they like sugarcoat it, or like they forget to add details that like are very important to that.
Yeah, so they kind of rely on these stereotypes or tropes, right?
Yeah, and I would say like breakout room 1 mentioned like Disney and like Nickelodeon is also how like they're over analyzing it,
Yeah, and so they definitely like over dramatize difference, right? And kind of centering the self in many ways. A lot of Disney films that we'll kind of talk about this semester definitely do that, and try to like present the other as very exotic, and saying, well, see, I'm not saying anything bad, I'm not being really negative, I'm saying they're beautiful and different, and I have all these fantasies about them, but and really in doing that is still maintaining the self and other, right? So not looking at these cultures as a norm in and of themselves. Okay, great. Anything else that breakout room 3 wanted to add? All right. So we have some really good examples here to kind of think about. Oh, and then, yeah, also I mentioned like disability definitely being something that people are othered for. Okay, so as an extension of this, like I asked you all to read the article on Orientalism. And Orientalism is a specific theory that takes the notion of othering and it applies it to how the East, how the Orient is described in art and film, writing, paintings, all kinds of depictions, music, right? Those kinds of things. So let's just watch like two kind of short clips that kind of give a grounding for this, that will explain some more things within that text, and then we'll talk about it briefly. Okay.
The late academic Edward Said developed the term Orientalism to describe how Europeans portrayed the Orient as inferior, uncivilized, and all around weird, but in fact defining Europe as the Orient's opposite, superior, civilized, and all around wonderful. The actual term the Orient refers to the rising of the sun in the East and comes from the Latin word oriens. So we could think of Orientalism as Easternism, or stereotyping of the East. Orientalism, then, is the form of knowledge, in quotation marks, that authorizes and justifies the assertion of Western power over the East. What does this actually mean? Orientalism acts like a pair of glasses that distort your vision and exaggerate cultural and religious differences. With these glasses, just about everything and everyone seems highly exotic and strange, or worse, fanatical and dangerous. Women in the Middle East, for example, appear only as exotic, a belly dancer or oppressed, a quote-unquote veiled woman, with no nuances in between. And in the early 20th century, you might have seen men portrayed as exotically romantic, or more recently, as crazy and fanatical, a terrorist, and miss all the ordinary human beings along the way. Many Arabs, Muslims, and Asians embrace this controversial term to describe the unique kind of racism they experience. Orientalism encapsulates for many how their culture, religion, and ethnicity are so often reduced to a stereotype, causing their humanity to be overlooked and culture misunderstood. Isn't this just a form of stereotyping then? Well, yes and no. Orientalism is about a much broader set of power relations. When the US government views the Middle East through Orientalist glasses, it creates policies with far-reaching consequences, from outright war waged on other countries to imposing a travel ban on whole groups of people. Perhaps the trickiest thing about Orientalism is that it's not fueled by ignorance or a simple lack of knowledge, just the opposite. It has historically been produced as knowledge by those in positions of power, whether government officials, religious figures, or the media. For example, when President Trump stated, "I think Islam hates us. We can't allow people coming into this country who have this hatred for the United States," he effectively characterized the 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide as anti-American. Even today, Orientalism continues because it is so ingrained in how we see other peoples and cultures that it goes unnoticed. Even the term, the Middle East, is considered to be Orientalist because it standardizes a Western viewpoint by referring to West Asia and North Africa as the middle of the East. Much of what counts as knowledge about the Middle East and parts of Asia is still produced through those distorting and reductive glasses. And just like in the 18th and 19th centuries, Orientalism remains powerful because it shapes not just how people in the West view the East, but also how they view themselves.
Okay. Yeah, so it's become so ingrained in writing and in art, and in established scholarship, right? People don't even notice that they're doing it. And so I want us to notice this, right? I want us to be really aware of that when a lot of these stereotypes come up over and over again. So here they brought up some really interesting, important stereotypes that are part of Orientalism. So women who are depicted in the Middle East from the outside, right, are depicted as either really helpless victims who are oppressed and forced to wear veils or forced to do things, or as really sexualized, exotic fantasies, right? So these fantasies of the exotic woman of the East kind of being mysterious, right? And we'll see that in some of the readings that we come across this semester. And then also with males, right? So I mentioned kind of being seen as like dangerous or scary, or also like kind of mysterious and sexualized. So if any of you are familiar with the old films of like Lawrence of Arabia, right? So this is portraying like men of the East, again, as kind of this exotic, desired, like mysterious thing, right? And not as like nuanced human beings and individuals and normal, right? Oh, I watched this film recently called Under the Sheltering Sky, which is based on a book by Paul Bowles. And it was like riddled with exoticism. It's about this like American couple who's going to Morocco and then traveling across North Africa as just this like experience. And they have really, this American couple has really like bad morals. They do, and they kind of go out and seek these experiences with the exotic other. And desire them as this exotic, like sexualized ideal. And so when watching it, I'm like, oh my God. So that's a really rough film. Okay, so here's another clip.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works, not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justified through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves, the exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype. Decode the fiction. Unlearn the myth.
Okay. Yeah, so in seeing that, do any like examples come to mind then of potential, oh, sorry, I'm sitting. So do any of the like potential examples come to mind of Orientalism? I'll kind of start with one. If any of you have been to Disneyland and have gone on the Jungle Cruise, has anybody gone on the Jungle Cruise? So if I'm sure there's actually probably a lot of YouTube videos of people going on the Jungle Cruise ride, right? But it's basically like people being tourists in what's determined to be an exotic place, and seeing all of these sights, right? Seeing all of these exotic animals. They had people for many years. I wonder if they may have removed that more recently. People who kind of fit in these other stereotypes of like barbaric and whatnot, right? They would have them kind of like threatening to shoot you with bows and arrows and whatnot, and spears. Then they would have like the guide, right? The guide on the boat has a fake gun, and then they shoot like the hippos because it's dangerous, right? Seen as like the exotic is dangerous and different and scary, and then you're safe because you get to come back and get off the boat. Okay, any other, like in watching these, any other examples of Orientalism that come to mind for you? And maybe if you're a shy person, that would be great to hear from you.
I'll just say, you know, our generation growing up with what started as, well, I'm just thinking of, I'll say 9/11. So it was really easy. I think I was in the 7th grade, and my mom was driving me to school when everything was happening, and just immediately the media and family and community bombarding us as kids with this concept of the Middle East. And right away, that just being something that we were taught and told. And obviously getting older and, you know, becoming an adult and learning about what's really going on and what's really happened here, and talking about things like Orientalism, and being able to trace this back to middle school, that we were taught this in our, you know, society that's supposed to have progressed and is supposed to know better. Now we're still doing this to this day. We still refer to it as the Middle East. Like that's like a theme of our generation. It's been forever for me. So that's
that's a really good. Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for me, that's like the most obvious example, and that's like a really general kind of touching on something that's really deep and is much bigger. But
yeah, so after like 9/11, there was this big reaction, right? And especially in the rhetoric that was used, the way that public figures spoke about it, the way it was shown in the media, right, was this is the scary other from the East, right, from the Middle East, and kind of like lumped into one group together, and like saying, see, they're out to get us. We have to defend ourselves. We have to now wage war because we have to defend ourselves against it. And it was 9/11 then was used to justify re-entering like war in Iraq, right? Even though they were not related to what had happened. But that then being kind of used as like this imperial expansion, right? And we're still technically in war in Afghanistan. So yeah, it lasts for a very long time. So that's a really good example. Other examples that you all can think of?
Piggybacking off of that, it goes back to our article in that we started defining ourselves based on 9/11, because the onslaught of music that was like America hype, F other countries, beat them up, stuff like that, like really was heavy at that time. So yeah. I just thought that was interesting, because I thought of the same example as she did, but then in the article it's we define ourselves when we start to other people, and that was like the first thing we did was like every country music star had some sort of like yes America, boo other people.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thought, that it's kind of really setting firm boundaries about the self, and saying, like, say with like country music in that time, that I am like defining what America is, and I'm hyper patriotic, and it was a very much reaction to that event, but it was a way of kind of firming up those borders and saying, like, you are only American if you feel this way and think this way and look this way, right? And so in America, there are many, many people who were of descent of like Arabian Peninsula countries, North Africa, Asian countries, right, who kind of dealt with a lot of discrimination. And so a couple years ago, I actually did an oral history project where I interviewed some classmates that I had in graduate school, some friends who were Muslim women, and then created a play based on those interviews. And so it was a way to kind of say, hey, you know, this is the South. These are, you know, these women that I work with and know. And it is much more nuanced than this like people's assumptions, right? And all of these women are American in different ways, but maybe grew up in Turkey, maybe their parents grew up in Turkey. Some women who whose parents were from Pakistan, you know, various different places, or like a woman who I interviewed grew up in the Midwest, and after 9/11, she met her future husband, and then she converted to Islam. And so there's like a great nuance within many cultures, but it's very easy for, especially after 9/11, for them to be kind of stereotyped. Any other examples?
I think after like adding more to the 9/11, I think after 9/11, more people were stereotyped and like, but it was just people of color or like people from different like communities, but not like the white people from America. Like, it's just like other people, it was just bad for them to do it, but if Americans did it, it was okay.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. So it's kind of, there's more leeway given to the in-group, and the out-group has more restrictions, right? That they can't deviate in any way because then they'll be punished for it. But people within like the dominant group are not punished for doing the same things. So that's a really good point. And you can look at that too in like prosecutions, right? White people who commit the same crimes are not arrested at the same rate, and are not prosecuted at the same rate, and are not incarcerated at the same rates, right? Other examples. So I think like the 9/11 example is really, really important because that's kind of the like culmination of Orientalism and othering, and it builds from all of these other kind of like what do I want to say? Like less overt, kind of seen as less threatening, entertaining forms of Orientalism. But this is kind of the ultimate, like what happens at the end. So if any of you watch like the Indiana Jones films, when you watch, so for Wednesday, you'll be watching the brief like on Orientalism documentary interviewing Edward Said. He can explain it much better than I can, but he gives a lot of examples from recent films, and especially like the 80s and 90s. Man, there were so many action films. Just watch any action film, right? You could just pick one like out of a list, and I guarantee there was Orientalism in it. In all of the films, like the bad guy was seen as like this bad terrorist who was out there to kill like Americans, and so it was the duty of the hero to go out and kill as many as possible, right? And just kind of like mow over a lot of people and not see them as individuals. Or have any of you seen, oh gosh, what is that movie with Liam Neeson and his daughter gets stolen and turned like
Taken?
Taken? And then she gets like forced into like the sex trade or something, and is like put in all like white clothing and stuff. And did they put her on a boat, or I can't remember.
It's something like Purity is like because she's white.
So that is like the most Orientalist film I have seen recently, and it was so shocking. And so he has to go out and find her, right? And so he does his own investigation. Then he goes into this underground. It was in Paris, through Paris, right? So in Paris, there's a lot of Orientalist fears, right? And this film totally plays on that. And so he goes into this underground area, and then he, has to fight his way through all of these like terroristic characters who are controlling his daughter, and he has to get to this underworld to go save her, right? Yeah, I mean, that movie. So yeah, later in the semester, you guys will be put in, you can work in teams and you can pick something that you want to analyze. So that could certainly be a good example to analyze, an easy one to analyze, I would say, because he has to save her. And oh yeah, I forgot. Wasn't she supposed to be like a virgin and had been on this trip and had been kidnapped on this trip? And so they're preserving her virginity and they're going to sell it to the highest bidder. Oh my God. Yeah, that film is terrible. So that could be a really interesting example to analyze, right? And it's seeing the South, the West, as this like virginal woman that needs to be protected, right? The daughter's representing all of that, and like about the dad like controlling the daughter's sexuality. And sending her out on this trip. How old was she supposed to be in that? Like 16? How old was she?
I thought she was like 17, graduate, and she went with like a friend who did not get the
Europe?
pretty white person treatment.
Yeah, and then they were gonna go to some concert. U2? Like who goes and travels around the world to watch U2? But anyway, yeah, that's that film is.
There's actually Taken 1 and then Taken 2. I feel not that I remember, but I think Taken 2 is a little bit more dramatic. Not
They
sure.
made the second one?
Yeah, there's like a second one.
What happens in the second one?
That was the chair, don't think. I'm not really sure. I'm trying to like remember what happens, but I feel the second one was just more dramatic.
I think that the second one was like both the mother and the daughter were taken. And like,
yeah, by like the stepdad. Wasn't it like by the stepdad? And then like the stepdad ends up getting murdered and all that stuff. It's crazy.
Okay. I'm gonna look that up right after this. Oh no, I can't believe they made a second one. So see
and I
how
think
much
there was a
money
third
it made?
one.
It made enough. No. Oh
I
my
think
God.
yeah, in that one he was the one that was taken. And the daughter had to get him back or something. I don't know. I stopped after the first one.
So it made enough money that they were able to make multiple sequels, right? So this like continues, right? Orientalism exists, like totally. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna look these up. I don't want to watch them, but I will look up some clips on them. Okay. Well, I think that's a really good way to kind of sum up our class. So those kind of like forms of entertainment then build themselves up into policy, right? Build them into people's thinking. It becomes ingrained in the way people look at the world. And looking at the other, continually saying, well, I'm the self, you're the other, me, you, in group, out group, right? It just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. And so people can't step outside of it and see it, right? So when they're creating policy, they don't see that that's part ingrained in their thinking, right? So that's the biggest extension of it. Okay, so let me share my screen. So for Wednesday, I have a very brief, like 2-minute introduction here. Watch on Orientalism. I think it's about 30 minutes. This is really like useful to hear it from Edward Said's perspective, and then complete Journal 4 to go along with that. All right. And then and I know it's kind of weird that like some of my descriptions are like week by week. Since we're meeting just once a week, then you have to look ahead to the following week. For week 3, we'll start to read Columbus. Okay, so I may adjust some of this, but we're going to start reading Columbus. And so that'll be a really interesting look into his mind and thinking, and how this, some of the early, it wasn't even the beginning, but some of the early written accounts in which groups of people were othered. What else did I want to mention? I can't recall. Oh, and then we'll start to look at your personal travel log. assignment, but I wanted you to see start reading some examples of travel logs before I have you do that. But just kind of start brainstorming some experiences you've had in travel, either traveling to a very far away place, or if you haven't done a lot of like exterior travel, it could be just an experience that you had in a new place, maybe when you originally like moved to college, or visiting a different state or different town or area, right? So when have you encountered cultural difference? Okay. All right. So any questions for me? Oh wait, there's a chat.
I do have one quick question. When I was like looking at the journals, I seen that people could do like voice or video.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because I was like, I don't really know what you mean. So like, if I'm like reading it, for instance, I just like I'm on camera now, just record myself talking about it for 2 to 3 minutes and then post that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just if you want to record rather than write down your journal, just make sure that the recording is like 2 to 3 minutes and you're kind of completing the same criteria, right? You're summarizing what you read or watched, and then you give me your reaction to it. So if you feel more comfortable doing that, that's great. Like, you know, I'm very open to that. And or if any of you are creative writers and want to write a creative piece inspired by what you read, I'm open to that too. If you do artwork, like, yeah, so.
Artwork. And if we do artwork, do we also do that like video and explain like what?
You can if you want, or you can submit the artwork and just put a little description for me. And so the artwork, like I know you and I trust that it would be like in depth, but I don't want somebody to draw a stick figure and be like, this is my artistic rendering of, no, like it has to like put some effort into it, right? But if you're inspired to do that, I really hope you do. Okay, oh yeah, and I forgot, this would be interesting to look at. Let me make a note to myself. Hopefully I'll remember. So social media influencers totally build on Orientalism, and like get all of their travel paid for because they go to the most like exotic place they can think of and take photographs and post it, right? And take all these really like highly edited and posed photographs. There a lot of them I can think of, like in Turkey, they have a big hot air balloon festival, you know, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of photographs of that, of these like women who are scantily clad, Instagrammers who then like take a picture with all these exotic balloons in the backdrop, or women going to like Bali or wherever, right? So that would be really interesting to analyze too. So
also like when you think about Instagram and like some of the photos you see, the fashion industry and how much they like in essence really like culturally to sell their merchandise or like the theme of whatever their fashion show is supposed to be. And so you like, I've seen like, you know, European descent walking down the aisle with like bantu knots, and they probably don't even understand what like historically that means, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like when you think about like the Kardashians, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, just like a lot of cultural appropriation that takes place also on like social media.
Yeah, and so like through fashion, a lot of cultures become accessorized, right? They become accessories and are used just as like pretty drippings and backdrops and you know whatever. And then I stopped watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians a few years ago, but I don't know if any of you ever saw that episode where Khloe and Scott Disick were going to a party and he was dressed as a sheik. Did anybody ever see that? So he was dressed in kind of he put on this really stereotypical head garb, and was supposed to be like a sheik from the Middle East. And they posted pictures of it on social media. And as soon as they did that, people were like, whoa, what are you doing? You're appropriating this culture. You're wearing this as a costume for like a Halloween costume. And it was so interesting because Chloe and Scott were like clueless. And we're kind of like, why is this a bad thing? I don't see why that's a bad thing. I don't understand, right? And so like Halloween's coming up soon. A lot of people will wear like costumes of other cultures as their costume.
And I remember also seeing like there was another fashion show, and I forget also where like what culture this is from. I think it's like maybe like in the atmosphere, or I'm not too sure, but they like wear like really big bangles around that like that's like considered beautiful in their culture. Also, that being in a fashion show, obviously they're next to look the same, but using those bangles just like to kind of emphasize what they're trying to sell. You know?
Yes. Where was it? I don't want to mix it up, but I think it was some tribes in Nairobi, perhaps, right? Who wear like the stacked necklaces, you mean? Yeah. And so that definitely like gets appropriated. Or, oh gosh, if this is terrible, like thinking of old cartoons, and they would depict that and like depict like women's heads as very stretched, right? And yeah, so like fashion shows totally like will take that. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't want to like traumatize you all, but I'm thinking of like this fashion show recently where they knitted like facial coverings, and then the knitted facial coverings that had very exaggerated physical features. Yeah, which one was that? I'll have to look that up, but it was really terrible, and had very exaggerated, very exaggerated like features that were very racialized, right? Yeah, so I didn't even think about the fashion industry. Very problematic, right? Okay, so these you all are thinking of some really good examples that we'll look at and that you can analyze this semester. Like think of the ones that you're really interested in that you want to look at more deeply and research. Okay, thank you so much for a really great discussion in class this morning. And so make sure to watch on Orientalism, do your journal, and then I'll send you a message about next week when we'll start reading Columbus. So, okay, thanks. I look
I
forward
have a
to
question, sorry.
Yes.
For the journals, last week, I have in my notes that Monday journal is due before Wednesday,
Yes.
the next class, but then on Wednesday journal is due until Sunday. Well, before Monday.
Before Monday, yeah.
The reason I'm asking is because I saw your email yesterday where it says that journal 3 was due before class today. So I thought journal 3 was due until Wednesday because it was assigned for today.
Oh,
That's what I thought.
Yeah, and so I can try to go in because switching over to Canvas is a different system. And so in iLearn, I was not able to put like due dates on the journals, like as specifically as I would have liked to. So if I have time, I'll try to like go in and like update the journals for when they're due, but just assume that if it says like read before class or before class, that it should be done before that class. So as long as you really have, I'll be honest, as long as you have your journals done before our Monday meetings, whatever time you need to do that is fine with me, right? But so if you need to do your Wednesday journal later, that's totally okay. As long as you have them done before a Monday meeting, so you're prepared for a discussion, that's okay. Is that helpful?
Yes, I just got confused because we had 2 journals for the first week, which was, the one on due on Wednesday, then the Wednesday due on before today. But then when I saw journal 3 due 2, I thought, 3 journals per week. So I got kind of confused.
Yeah, so it's just like most classes, there'll be one journal. And so since we don't meet in Zoom on Wednesday, it's kind of your independent study day to do that work. So it's like you're doing the same amount of work you would do if we had a physical class. So I'm just not meeting with you on Zoom to do that. But yeah, usually I have like a journal due per class.
Okay, okay, that was it. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Were we supposed to post our journal one? Because I know it was like done in class.
Yeah, so if you wrote it down physically in like a journal, just take a picture of it and submit that. But if you like type something out, or since we kind of did that brainstorming in class, just use what we brainstormed, take one of those examples and use that as your journal. So just kind of put it in written form or record yourself or whatever you'd like to do. Okay? Okay. So thank you, everybody. If you have any other questions, please let me know. And then my office hours are after this, starting at 10. I'll be on Zoom. So if you need anything, please jump on and join me. So, okay. Have a good morning.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.